So good evening, everybody. I want to wholeheartedly welcome you. I'm very, very happy that we are holding this evening. I'm going to say a little bit more about Rob Eshman in a moment, but I'm very, very delighted that you're here to speak with us and converse with us. I want to say a few opening words first, though, about what we're doing here. This is the first in what I intend will be a series of conversations like this about Israel, and I'm calling them slow-cooked thoughts. I don't know if you know this, but when you're a rabbi or the leader of an organization right now, a Jewish organization, probably most organizations, there is great pressure to be the first one out of the gate anytime something happens. Right, to be the first one with a statement, to give the most quotable words to your community, and to get it out there right away. And I will tell you that I hate that pressure. I understand that we need to respond to the world around us, but first of all, certainly in this world, in this day and age, you make a statement and then you open the news again and the story's already changed, and it's like, okay, cancel that. And also, as I said in my email, I'm just partial to thoughts that we take a little bit more time for. I heard an interview on, I don't remember if it was On Being, it was, a radio interview where they were interviewing an author, and in the preamble, she said, we produce our interviews exactly as they are. We don't cut out the silences. So there are going to be pauses in this interview. And the author said, I don't think we should be embarrassed to think in public. So I would like us to not be embarrassed to think in public, and to take our time and to change our mind and to listen to one another and to really allow our thoughts to stew. So I'm really delighted that we're here. And one other word I want to say about sort of what we're doing here is that something I've been asked in recent months especially is some version of, what does Temple Israel stand for on Israel? What's our position? I read this on our website. Is that our position? Somebody said that. Is that our position? And I want to tell you what I am for. I am for dialogue. I am for, thank you, I am for thinking and hearing and listening and rethinking. And I want this to be a community. I've already heard a few people say tonight things like, I don't have a safe space where I can think about this. I don't have a place where I can, it's moving so fast, and there are so many, college campuses in Israel itself, in Gaza itself, at my workspace, among my political friends, they're just, it's moving so fast, and it's so difficult, and I don't have time and place to think through it. And I would like this to be a center of thinking through it, of an exchange of ideas. I love it when I'm in conversation with somebody and they turn me a little bit. I never thought about it from that particular perspective. Maybe that'll change my opinion, maybe it won't, but I want us to be open to things that we hear. It's so, everybody says it, but like outside of our bubble. So I am going to guarantee you that I'm going to invite somebody to this series, and maybe I already have tonight, with whom you disagree. We'll see. That's part of the point. I want us to try to give the best read to views that are not our own, and I want us to take them in and see what we can learn from them and see what we can share and come to some understanding. I will say there are positions on the right and on the left that are outside of what I believe we stand for. And I can go into them now or another time. So I'm not saying that absolutely everything goes, that I'm okay with absolutely every opinion, that I would share every opinion, from the bima, from our microphone. But putting those beliefs on either side outside, I want this to be a safe space where we can explore our thoughts and learn from one another. I think that this is obvious, but I just feel like I want to say it, and it might be more important to say. I could be wrong, but when we have a little bit more controversial speakers, I'll say just quickly. As many of you know, I went to UCLA when the Palestinian protests were going on, and the Israeli pro-Israel kind of rally was there. And the thing that it was so sad. I was just so heartbroken. And the thing that broke my heart the most was how much there was trying to outshout each other. Everybody was trying to outshout each other. And I think even worse and more symbolic of the moment we're in, tons of people shouting with a camera right here, waiting for the other side to throw the first punch, trying to provoke a fight that they started. And needless to say, I reject that kind of engagement. And for our space, this is not going to be a place that we're shouting each other down. This is not going to be a place that, this is going to be a place that we're going to listen respectfully and kindly, and all of those kinds of things. And I think what I want us to try to do is stretch to tolerate hearing things that are uncomfortable. Doesn't mean you agree with them. I am not trying to convince you of anything. But just to try to stretch and maybe sit with something that is not exactly the way that I feel. A phrase that we started the year with, mostly internally in our staff and a little bit in our boardroom, is a word in Hebrew, shamati, which means I heard you. And so when somebody shares an experience, it's just a way to affirm, maybe I agree, maybe I disagree, maybe I like it, maybe I don't like it, but I hear you. And I think maybe that's the starting place of deeper understanding of one another. We'll ask hard questions starting tonight. We'll have hard conversations, and let's listen to each other. So thank you for your patience with my slow-cooked thoughts, and thank you for being here tonight. And a word about Rob Eshman. Sue Freudenheim Core introduced me to Rob, I don't know, a year or so ago, but he is a legend in the journalism world and in the Jewish journalism world. He's the former publisher and editor-in-chief of Tribe Media. He started his career as a staff writer at the Jewish Journal in 1993. In 2009, he founded Tribe Media. That company produces the Jewish Journal, jewishjournal.com, and Tribe Magazine, with 1.5 million users and viewers. And a multi-platform Jewish news app, hollywoodjournal.com. Both the Jewish Journal and Rob have won numerous local and national awards for writing, design, and community leadership. He has written for the Jerusalem Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Huffington Post. He's a frequent commentator on LA area radio and television shows. He teaches at USC and the University of Minnesota. He is senior columnist and former editor of The Forward, well-known national, very, very important Jewish paper. And he writes a blog called Foodieism. So if you're interested in food, you should follow that, among other things. He tends his garden of fruits and vegetables and 6 chickens and 2 goats. Is that still true? No? I'm sorry to hear that. Very sorry to hear that. We love goats in my family. It's a long story. So I'll ask some questions a little bit later. I'll open it up to you. But Rob, first of all, welcome. It's really great to have you here. When we talked a few weeks ago about this conversation, we were trying to figure out sort of what we were going to do tonight as opposed to in other nights in this series. And you said, listen, I think what I can most offer my area of expertise is the role of American Jews in this moment. So I'd like to ask you, what's the role of American Jews in this moment?
Is this on?
No.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I think this is a great idea. I really do. I think we need more of this. First role is to learn. There's a lot of stuff going on, and I think it's to gather information from a lot of different sources. And the second role is to stand by the values that you believe in and the people that represent those values. So people say, you got to stand by Israel. Well, you have to choose which Israel you want to stand by, because it's not a monolith, obviously. Or you have to stand, or stand with the Palestinians. Well, you have to choose which Palestinians. And so I think it's, learn, define your values, and stand by your values. And sometimes the categories out there are not necessarily the ones that match the values we have inside.
And thank you. And do you think in particular the diaspora Jewish voice should get involved, should not get involved,
Oh, yeah. I mean, that argument, which was
yes.
really just a fervent argument when I started in the Jewish world. Sandy Weiner, who's here, he reminded me that, what year was that, 1980? I lived in Israel for 2 years. I came back and I got a job as the first director of Peace Now on the West Coast, American Friends of Peace Now. And you couldn't open your mouth about Israel without everybody arguing. And I once asked Amos Oz, who was very involved in Peace Now, and I became, I wouldn't say friendly, but we had a lot of interactions in my journalism career. And he said, you know, people always said, Jews need to be unified. And he goes, sure, just unify around me. That's what they mean when they say you have to have unity. They usually mean just unify.
Well, and if I can, you know, when I was first in Israel, I was living on a kibbutz, and they had all these speakers come through, and one of them just very clearly said, "This is the agreement. We live here. We're on the front lines. We're defending the Jewish state. You come visit and send your money. Thank you very much. We don't need your opinion. We've got that covered." And I think that with the rallies around the judicial reform, I heard a very different call from Israelis saying, we need your help.
It's too small a world. It was never a good argument because it wasn't multilateral. It was always like, you can't talk about that, but we could talk, or you can't fund that, but we could fund this.
Yeah.
I mean, the right has always poured tons of money. The American Jewish right has always poured tons of money into their causes. The Jewish left has a right to pour money into their causes. It's just the way it is. And what we're seeing now is that, you know, our fates are tied. Our fates are tied. What happens there affects us here.
Yeah.
Certainly what happens here in Congress and elsewhere affects them there. So the idea that we should not, you know, you have to do it with humility. And that's why I wanted to talk about the role of American Jews. I don't pretend to be either an expert on, you know, Israeli politics. I'm an expert on knowing who the experts are. But I don't speak as an Israeli, but I do speak as an American Jew, and I think as an American Jew I have a right to talk about what our role should be.
So I want to ask, very particularly in the last day or so, you came out with an article calling on American Jews to do what some European countries have done in the last few days, which is recognize a Palestinian state. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, not a popular opinion, turns out. You know, for a couple reasons, or a few reasons. One is, again, I didn't used to think that was a useful thing.
Yeah.
Especially after Oslo, I felt like, you know, the Palestinians have to come farther in meeting their obligations under Oslo. I didn't think Arafat was an honest broker, and I didn't think that that he would pocket that as a win and not do any of the hard decisions.
And the argument there really has been, look, the two states there need to come to that agreement on their own.
Right, right.
And you've shifted in your position.
Well, I think given the intransigence of Bibi, I mean, he's been prime minister for a total of 16 years, and he's made it really clear he has no interest in compromise with the Palestinians. And I think the world thinks differently. Mm-hmm. So the argument that, you know, it's unilateral, well, it's kind of unilateral now that we're not recognizing it. I think that if you don't, you know, the fact that his own defense minister, who's not a flaming liberal, Galan, got up and said, you have no plan.
Yeah.
There's no exit ramp.
Yeah.
There's no future. There's no political horizon. And we can't win just with arms.
Yeah.
Even if we could win with arms, which isn't even clear, we can't just, there has to be a political horizon. And I think showing the Palestinians who are showable that there is a diplomatic solution, that there is a horizon, it will give hope because, you know, you haven't lost the West Bank yet. You know, it could get, as bad as it is, it could get much worse.
For sure.
The biggest nightmare for Hamas is a state of Palestine side by side with Israel. When you look at what the president of Norway said, or the president of Spain, they said, we're doing this because we believe in a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel. That's not Hamas's goal. That's not even the goal of most of the people on these campuses now. I mean, they are saying exactly, personally, what I believe, as far-fetched as it seems sometimes. So I think it's time to say, yeah, that's what we want too. And, you know, the other argument is, but doesn't it like reward violence and doesn't it reward terror? I mean, part part of this tragedy of being a human being is that sometimes violence and terror are rewarded. And they were, the Jewish underground committed violent acts against the British, and that's one of the things that drove the British out. Sometimes it works. But I think mostly what it does is it's an affront to the rejectionists on both sides. And so I do think it's important. It turns out there were a lot of people that didn't agree. Judging by the letters.
You've heard from them, I gather.
Yeah.
You asked this in your article, but just to talk about it a little bit, the question is, what does that look like? We can't put an embassy there. We can't. What for a normal American Jew? How do I acknowledge it? How do I make that point to the liberal Palestinian, Israeli, global community?
I mean, the knee-jerk reaction of Biden that I was a little disappointed about. I thought he could have been more nuanced. I thought he could have picked out the parts of their declarations, but he just did that thing that, no, we believe in it. I think you write a letter, you speak up through organizations, and there are many in America that would, that maybe you push the organization you're involved with to actually declare formally. We have power, we have money, we have some influence, and so I think using it in that direction could be effective.
Yeah.
It certainly would get it. It turns out that it certainly is a statement that gets attention.
Well, no such thing as bad press, right?
And, one of the criticisms I got was, you can't have a state, look what happened with Hamas and Gaza, and it's just like, I think between saying there should be a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel and actually seeing what that would look like and how it would work and how it would evolve to what I hope would eventually be a confederation or something, because I think it's too small of a land to have two separate states, but then again, that's up for them to decide. It's like seeing someone pretty across the room and then having 4 kids with them and a wife and a house and a car. I mean, it's like, it's a long way to go.
Yes.
And I don't think, but I think you just...
Well, and that was maybe one of the critiques of Oslo, is that it was like this great idea and then everybody got ahead of themselves and we didn't stop and do what's the next step, Yeah. Coming back to America, is the golden age for the American Jew over?
The important Jewish thinkers in New York think so. I wrote that I think it's up to us, is the answer. I think that there was a cover story in The Atlantic about it that I wrote about, and Barry Weiss gave a speech at the 92nd Street Y about it that I included, and none of them mentioned that so much of the antipathy and the anger and sometimes the violence against American Jews has gone off the charts because of what's happening in Israel. And I think that there's a direct correlation, and 2 studies have found this, between what Israel is doing and violence in Israel and violence against American Jews, which goes to your earlier point about, should we be involved and how should we be involved? It affects us. So I think it's up to us. This is a country that has been unbelievably welcoming to Jews. Jews have at the highest levels of accomplishment and integration, and there's still, when you look at the polls of the most recent Pew polls about what religion other than your own would you like your child to marry into, Jews have been number one ever since they've been asking that question. I think, I'm going to say Catholics are number 2.
Interesting.
I wonder how Jews would answer that question. I don't know.
Maybe we'll ask before the night is over.
So, there's been a history of, acceptance and integration and accomplishment here. We have the vice president's husband. We have Biden, who did the most comprehensive plan against anti-Semitism of any president. There's a lot of, you have Congress now holding hearings about anti-Semitism. They're not holding hearings about Islamophobia. So the question is, do we take all that goodwill?
So, and then just, do I understand your earlier point as saying, if we might help ourselves in America by being willing to talk about what Israel is doing wrong or has done wrong over the years? That's how that came in? No.
I don't think we have to do it if we don't believe it,
Okay.
but I think that we have to understand that that's a problem for us here, and that's causing, the ADL came out with a came out with its annual statistic on the rise of anti-Semitic acts, and it was like off the charts, was like 300% higher. But what they did that year in 2023 was they started counting anti-Israel and anti-Zionist things. So every anti-Zionist slogan that was plastered on the ADL website or in the comment section, or every time somebody waved a flag saying from the river to the sea, you know, whether that's anti-Semitic or not, a lot of people will debate it, but it's clear that those expressions are not coming from living next to your Jewish neighbor. They're coming from this conflict in the Middle East that we have to see an end to, because it's going to make everybody safer. It's going to make Palestinians safer, Israelis safer, and certainly Jews around the world safer.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about Zionism. And I did not hear the whole thing, but Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Hartman's most recent podcast was about can Zionism win? And I think can Zionism prevail, maybe is the question. And I think the way I would ask it is there a defensible Zionism? Why are you a Zionist? Are you a Zionist?
Yeah, I'm a Zionist. But I tell people, like, I have Palestinian friends and anti-Zionist friends. I say, you know, are you pro-French? Like, you know, are you pro-Armenian? Like, it's just, we're people, and we have this, you know, we have this homeland, and there's 7 million of us in Israel now. So yeah, I want them to be...
One reason that I think Israel should exist, it's not the only reason, but is that it does exist, well, right? Like how would you get from point A to point B?
So
like
that's what I ask people. Okay, so what do you want?
Right.
Which is such a good question. It's like, okay, if you know, we could argue about 48. We could argue about pick a year. We could argue about Abraham and Isaac. We could argue Ishmael, and we could whatever you want to argue. But what do you want now? And I wrote a column called Noga. #Noga, no one's going anywhere, which to me is just the fundamental truth of this whole conflict. I don't care what you think about the history, and I don't care, you know, what you think is right or just now. How do you solve a problem when there's 15 million people between the river and the sea, and they're not moving? And anybody who says, and that's why some of these college protests are just so dispiriting to me, because, you know, I'm a child of the late 60s, where, you know, the Vietnam War was essentially a pro-peace, you know, it was pro-peace.
Right. Yes.
And apartheid, which I marched against, was pro-peace. You weren't saying kill the white people. You were saying give control to the majority. Yeah. But these rallies, when you look at they're not pro-peace.
Correct. Right. They're not following the teachings of Martin Luther King and other nonviolent, you know, that is not the position of these protests. That's one of the problems.
Which is so funny to me, because it was so my point of view growing up, that was what you believed in college. Like college was the time you believed in nonviolence. Yes. And then you got jaded later.
Completely.
But they're pre-jaded.
Yeah. Yeah. they're yes. Yeah.
And I fault their teachers. I fault their moral leaders or their lack of moral leaders. But how could you ever think that it's going to make Palestinians safer to say we want to get rid of Israel? How does that happen peacefully? Yeah. And how do you ever think on the Israeli side, the kind of Jewish supremacist side, the people in Bibi's cabinet, how do you think that's going to end for Jews or for Palestinians if you think you're the ones who only will be in control, and now of Gaza? Yeah. So no one's going anywhere, and, you know, that's become my Zionists. The Jews who live there have a right to decide how they want to live. I don't care if it's a state. I don't care if it's that never really mattered to me. Yeah. Not that it matters what I think, but I'm just saying it's up to them. And the Palestinians should have equal rights in that same area, and they have to work it out. So
I want to share
that's my Zionism, and you know, it doesn't satisfy a lot of people, but.
I happen to have brought a quote by your friend Amos Oz that I really have thought about a lot. He wrote, I would be more than happy to live in a world composed of dozens of civilizations, each developing in accordance with its own internal rhythm, all cross-pollinating one another without anyone emerging as a nation state. No flag, no emblem, no passport, no anthem, no nothing. Only spiritual civilizations tied somehow to their lands without the tools of statehood and without the instruments of war. But the Jewish people has already staged a long-running one-man show of that sort. The international audience sometimes applauded, sometimes threw stones, and occasionally slaughtered the actor. No one joined us. No one copied the model the Jews were forced to sustain for 2,000 years, the model of a civilization without the tools of statehood. For me, this drama ended with the murder of Europe's Jews by Hitler. So in other words, I think like what you said, like, sure, that sounds great. Let every state be a democracy of its citizens. Let every state be, exist with multiple cultures, but you go first, like, why does Israel have to go first? Which I think is an important point. Let's talk a little bit more about college campuses. I had a session last night with a number of our 12th graders, and their anxieties about going to college are very, very high. They don't know how they're going to get along with their roommates. They don't know how they're going to walk across the quads. They don't know how they're going to build trust and be safe, and can they talk about Israel? I think you were also at UCLA. I think you wrote about that.
Well, I went the day after.
Oh, okay.
Very conflict averse.
Yeah,
No.
I understand. I thought I might leave in the middle if it got too ugly. I
literally couldn't go that day, but I did go. I noticed in an article, I think it was in the LA Times, they interviewed this woman who was off to the side from a group called Standing Together, which I'd just been in a webinar with. Yeah. And I didn't know they had an LA chapter, or I didn't know they had an active LA. I didn't know they were out protesting.
They were there the day I was there, and much smaller than either of the. But notable. I mean, they were there, and I had to go. But by the time I saw them, I thought I would really like to talk to these people and find out who they are. And,
So I did end up meeting one of the demonstrators from Standing Together, which is an Arab Israeli and Jewish Israeli movement, not a nonprofit and not a political party, but they're a movement within Israel for coexistence. And they have really gotten a lot more attention since this, and they've been very brave. They've gone out in the streets in T-shirts and, that have Arabic and Hebrew writing on them. And they were at the rally wearing T-shirts that said, return the hostages, ceasefire now. And they were confusing everybody. And they were chanting like loud, and they were chanting from Gaza to Tel Aviv, all children deserve to live. And people would start to join the chant, and then she was saying, like, people would start to join the chant, and then they would be so confused. It was blowing people's circuits that you could have a group that was, partly because they're so ignorant about Israel. They don't know that 20% of Israel is Israeli Arabs. They don't know that if you see a pharmacist in Israel, it's going to be an Arab. Many doctors are Arabs. They just don't know. And these people are very brave because they get persecuted in Israel as well.
Yeah. But growing traction, I think, over there.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. So I said that those are the demonstrators I support, but I'm just disappointed by the protests. I think that you're not going to get, like, again, I have met people who took part in the protests. One at the University of Indiana, a faculty member who took part in it, somebody at Dartmouth, and again, like, what do they want? Okay, so divestment. I think if you want to say colleges shouldn't invest in weapons corporations that make weapons, then great, but make it a rule across the board. I don't have a problem with that.
Right.
Don't support companies that build prisons and make it across the board. And I think that's pretty peaceful and noble, but the demonization of Israel, the erasure of Jews from that area, what's it going to lead to?
Do you think there's any way out, or do you think there is an alternative paradigm? It's an overused metaphor, but I'll share it anyway. I think I'm 52. I think people generally older than me see Israel as David, the young, vulnerable, scrawny, brave, willing to speak truth to power, creative, triumphant. And people certainly, I think it was Ezra Klein who pointed out that if you're 20 or younger, you've only known Netanyahu's Israel. And so we're Goliath, bully, oppressor, strong arm, unkind, unwilling to listen, so on and so forth. And I think that part of what we're seeing in intergenerational conversations and in the American conversation is we're David, you're Goliath, back and forth. How do we break out of that? What's another model? How can we rethink those paradigms?
I mean, see Israel as it is, and take time to learn to look at what it is. You know, go there if you can, talk to people, talk to Israelis from across the spectrum. But it's not David or Goliath. It's a country like other countries, you know, and it's full of crazy people and full of great people. And you know, my in-laws, my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law, they live in Mishmar HaNegev, which is a kibbutz 20 minutes from Gaza. So, you know, to look at it through their eyes and to see that, I mean, the level of trauma is going to be generational, what they've gone through. They only, you know, only because of the tragedy at the music festival are my in-laws alive today, because Hamas would have just swept through. But they didn't expect to run into this festival. Yeah. And so their kibbutz became a staging ground for the kibbutzim that were evacuated. And my sister-in-law just spent, you know, days and days and days taking care of these shell-shocked people who were taken to the kibbutz, and then it became a staging ground for the army before they went in. My brother-in-law is in charge of the agriculture, of the wheat and barley and all the grain agriculture in the south of Israel. So he was, you know, he probably went to 24 funerals, either for people he worked with or their family members. And then for you know, close friends whose kids died as IDF soldiers there. So, you know, is that David? Is it Goliath? It's just, there's so much pain.
I think one thing that is just critical to understand, and I've been to Israel twice since October 7th, and we just had a visiting scholar here, my very good friend and beloved teacher, Rachel Korazim, and that reminded me again that in America, probably the rest of the diaspora, we have, for the most part, moved on. We are in May. In Israel, it might as well be October 8th. It is one of the things that Rachel said is this, referring to some poetry, Shlomi kashur bechut l'shlomam. Don't ask me about my welfare. My welfare is directly tied to their welfare, meaning the hostages. Like, until they're home, until we know what's happened, until we know who's alive, I can't talk about anything else. And I felt that most notably when I was there in February, and we had these very thoughtful speakers who hate Bibi. They hate what's going on. They hate the government. And when I asked them, let's talk about the morality of this war, they didn't understand the question. They were so much inside the trauma that they couldn't talk about May or what was then February. They were in October, and I do think that's critical to understand.
I understand where they're coming from. A friend of mine who is kind of center-left, you know, after October 7th, I said, what do you think should happen? And he said, dust. I think Gaza should be dust. And this was somebody who was out protesting against Bibi, you know, every day before. And I really get it. I also think that's why the American Jewish voice is important, because we have a different perspective. And that's kind of important to have.
Just having some distance from it.
Yeah.
You know, and we can have understanding and deep compassion for those who don't have distance from it, and maybe there is something valuable we have to offer.
Yeah.
Last question, and then I'll open it up. You talked about your own experience, you know, in college and what we think of as college students. You know, I grew up that, like, if you want to change the world, sit around and sing a Peter, Paul, and Mary song, and, you know, and I think this moment has been so painful for lefty Jews who are very lonely and don't feel quite at home in any camp right now. And you know, one matter is what's actually happening on college campuses, but another matter is, you know, we feel like we feel like we did fit squarely in a box, and now we don't. And we don't quite know what to do with our love of Israel, and we don't know how to hold the conversation with people that we've worked very closely with on so many issues. And I wonder what you have to say about that.
It's depressing.
Yeah. Thank you. That done. It is.
I find great power and comfort in the third way. And I think there is a third way. I think that, we're in the middle of a terrible, vicious war, but there's always after a war. I mean, don't forget that after October 7th, they projected never again, #never again, on the Brandenburg Gate.
Yeah.
So just think what that means. 85 years after the Holocaust, they're coming to the defense of the Jewish people in the center of Berlin. There's been a horrible war against Israel, but Egypt didn't take part in it. Jordan didn't take part in it. And
all kinds of countries came to Israel's defense.
And all kinds of countries when Iran. So, don't tell me that this is an inevitable conflict that's only going to go from bad to worse, because we've seen that that's not true in history, and it's not true. And Israel is strong. I mean, I don't want to say cheesy, but the kind of stock footage of the IDF jets flying over Auschwitz. I mean, this is not a weak country.
Yes.
And to say that, which Bibi constantly says, that we can't. If we put a Palestinian state there, we'll be overrun in a second. Then what are you doing with all your defense money? And it's just not true. You let Hamas in. Yeah. I mean, that was a fatal error of the IDF and the leadership. Yeah. But it doesn't have to happen. And I think that, so I put my, if I find my voice through those groups in Israel, like Standing Together, groups in America, like New Israel Fund. Yeah. They're out there, and you're right. They're kind of a still small voice right now. But I think I have to believe that they're on the right track.
Yeah. Okay, let's open it up to some more questions. Go to Jesse.
So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for this conversation tonight. And this is the first I'm hearing of Standing Together, and it's very interesting. So what do they want? What is, once the hostages are released, and if there's a ceasefire, what's the next day for them?
As far as I know, and somebody here who maybe is more involved with them could tell me if they have like a 5-point program, but they want coexistence, they want equality for Israelis and Palestinians. They're not calling for the end of Israel. They're not calling for they're calling for democratically working out coexistence between the river and the sea, however that would work. And I don't think they have an actual political plan solution. But they reject violence, and they also have a stance on climate change, which I think is interesting, because I always think, that's what's going to kill everybody there.
It's like we used to say about car accidents in Israel. Yeah. I think also the little that I know, I think that they stand for shared humanity, right? I mean, it's such a statement. Return the hostages and end the war, stop the war, right? That's about shared humanity and ending the unbearable suffering on both sides.
So when was it this week that they announced that Bibi and his friend are being charged with war crimes? How do we react to that? Obviously, Biden has said, he doesn't agree with it, but for many of us, he should be charged. So can you talk about the influence of that on American Jewry?
This is, I don't think, for me, it's always, does this get us closer to peace and a solution or farther away? And I think those kinds of, that in particular, I don't know that it's going to bring us closer. Just like I don't know that boycotting Israeli institutions is going to bring us closer. But I do think, several years ago, Ehud Barak said, if we don't solve this problem, there's going to be a diplomatic tsunami against Israel. And he was so right. I mean, we're the people of prophets, right? And the reason we're the people of prophets is we ignore them, and then we find out they were right, and then we lionize them. I mean, when Israel conquered the West Bank in 1967, and they told Ben Gurion, "We've got the West Bank, we've got the Sinai, we've got Golan,"
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
and he said, "That's fantastic. Now give it back."
Yes, that's right.
And Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who I knew very well, was a general in the Israeli army, and he wrote a book. I knew him so well that I've now forgotten the name of the book. Who said this was the most amazing military conquest in modern history, but we can't keep it. Because everybody saw the writing on the wall. Yehoshua Leibovitz, everybody saw the writing, and nothing has changed. You can't rule over this ever-increasing millions of people and expect them to give up their desire for what you also desire. I mean, there's 15 million people. Well, we want it, and they just have to live with the consequences. And why can't they be refugees? And why can't they give up their dreams of home? We just had Passover. We don't give up we never forget anything. So I don't think it's fair to expect that. And I think that, but to answer your question, I think we have to focus on those things which really bring us closer. And I'm not sure that does, but I'm not sure.
So my question is, how do we win back the left? I mean, one of the things that's most disturbing to me is my friends on the left who I thought I was a lefty, and it's now clear that I'm more centrist than not. So, and that's, I think kids are not pacifists so much as lefties, and the left is filled with hate, and this includes, the academics who are teaching them and so forth. So, what do we do?
You have to talk to them. I mean, unfortunately, it's exhausting. But I always say, "What do you want? Like, what's your vision? How does your idea that Israel's an illegitimate settler colonial state, blah blah blah? So what do you want now? Do you want this?"
Just to be clear, you mean talk to them by shaming them and telling them their ideas are ridiculous?
No,
really?
literally. Yeah.
Oh, talk to them. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, just checking.
Yeah. So I'm in that cohort. All of our friends have college-age kids or a little older than college, and they're all kind of dealing with this, where their kids they couldn't talk about it at the Passover table. It was really tense. One of my friends was looking at his daughter's Instagram and saw his daughter in one of the protests, facing off, and just, and like you said, Susan, these are center lefty people whose own kids but you just have to you just have to talk to them and find out where they're coming from. And if they say, yes, I think they should leave, then what do you say? You lost them. And maybe they'll come around at some point, but then you lost them.
I think one question. Tell me why this is so important to you. Tell me why. Tell me where your perspective comes from and why it's so important for you. And if we're really lucky, they'll ask the same question in return.
Don't hold your breath.
I mean, I guess this is somewhat related. I feel like, obviously a small part, but part of the problem is Israel is very much losing the propaganda war. I feel like social media people just hear something and run with it. They don't bother to see, is it true? They take a lot of the disinformation and they just keep going. For example, I have met a UCLA professor supporting the student protest, and she had no idea what intifada meant. She was like, a professor, yes. And hopefully we got through to her and she understood and maybe rethought some of it. But how do you being in media, how can we help combat this? It seems like impossible when people just take the disinformation, take the misinformation and run with it and don't bother to find out enough to make an informed opinion or to have a discussion.
Yeah, I don't think there's a propaganda war you could win. I think you just have to win you have to come up, you have to work towards a peaceful solution and let the propagandists on either side fight it out. And there's plenty of propaganda on the Israeli side too that's completely wrong or one-sided or biased. So I think you again try to get to that other level of what's your solution, and how does that look to you, and what's going to get us there, and how does what you're saying get us there? You know, but just to your point that like when you see a lot of these little clips on TikTok or Instagram, usually from the pro-Israel side, interviewing people who don't know what some word means or something else. But you know, most people don't know what they're talking about when they go to political. Like, how many people went to the anti-gun? Remember that gun march downtown? We were there. It's like all these people were there. But if you'd stuck a mic in front of anybody and said, "What's the definition of a semi-automatic?" Like, you wouldn't have known. Most people wouldn't know. So it's not like I don't know that that's always fair, because you join a movement, you don't necessarily know the particulars. But I think people have to be held accountable for the positions they take. And so the only way is to really press them on what they think, because that's the more important thing. It's like, do you know the implications of what you're saying, and is that what you want? And like I was saying with Susan, if that's what they want, then, you know, good luck to them.
Coming over to the past president seating over here.
Hi, thank you for joining us. In the vein of what can be helpful and viewing what is and what isn't helpful, what do you think the role of the United States Congress and the Biden administration is in trying to end this conflict and influence what the day after would look like?
Well, I think Congress is most helpful by performatively dragging college professors in front of itself and showing off the weaknesses in higher education. That's been really helpful to solving the problem. Yeah, you know, it got some attention on the issue, but has it really, like, I mean, have the protests gone away?
No, they were there.
No, but have the protests gone away? Yeah, but I mean, has it really lowered the temperature on college campuses? I don't think so. I mean, it's just, like, there's things you could do that are more productive, I think. And I think that it's part of this other agenda they had pre-existing. And so much of this is playing out with pre-existing agendas, you know, or, you know, to try to score political points with an election coming up. Of course, America has enormous power. And I think Biden is, you know, this grand scheme he has, this grand agreement he has that would bring Saudi Arabia into peace with Israel, which would be such a game changer. I mean, it would be Hamas's worst nightmare. It's one of the reasons they launched it on October 7th. So, you know, but to do that, Bibi has to stand up to the radicals in his cabinet. And so, yeah, Congress could say we're behind that. Senate could say we're behind that. I think it would have enormous power. But I think it's so caught up in electoral politics that it's just, I'm not holding my breath for Congress.
Yeah, excuse me. Along that line, I'm tremendously uncomfortable by Congress using us, because they keep putting it in the area of anti-Semitism, not of Israel, using us as some sort of a poster child for them to make political points. And I think that's very dangerous to us. And I don't know, how would you like to comment on that?
I know what you mean by it feels dangerous to us. I think I know what you mean. You mean like it's making it kind of like it's about us, you know, the most important. I see what you mean, and because I hear that from a lot of people. Look, I think that I like that when there's flare-ups of anti-Semitism, it's taken seriously at the highest levels of government. I don't mind that at all. I think but I also think that just focusing on that and not doing the work of focusing on helping the parties over there reach an agreement and supporting the parties. I mean, the Republicans in Congress have given a blank check to Bibi, and I don't think that's helpful. And so I think in the long run of how to really lower the temperature, lower the heat, lower the amount of actual anti-Semitism in this country, that would have so much more impact than you know, passing a law with the definition of anti-Semitism and having these endless arguments over whether it's whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I mean, we know it's like pornography. You know when you see it, and you know we have a very good spidey sense of when something crosses the line, and you don't need to legislate it. But I think the larger picture is deal with the problem. And the problem is going on over there.
I don't know if this is exactly what you mean, Jerry, but a question that I have that I think is related is about the potential of Israel. I think it's been growing for a long time. Peter Beinart called it out a number of years ago, to become a wedge issue, a political wedge issue, and be sort of used, is your term, but sort of parlayed into deeper divides between left and right, deeper polarization, sort of with Jews and Israel supporters as more of a pawn than an actor.
And it's really a shame to see some Jews get either sucked into it or be part of be part of that,
Yeah.
you know. And I don't think it has. I grew up when Israel was a bipartisan issue, and I think
Yes.
it's Israel is strongest when it is a bipartisan issue.
I have kind of the counterpoint of Susan's question, which is, what do we do with the Israeli right? You know, I think a comment was made that here in America, as part of the diaspora, we have some perspective and we can be more objective. But certainly my experience has been that Israelis here do not have any objectivity, and there's no room for discussion of the Israeli right and how we deal with that. I'm wondering what your view is.
It's the fight of a lifetime. I mean, and it's the fight of Zionism from the very, very beginning. I mean, this is ultimately what we're seeing playing out, is the fight at the founding of Israel between the revisionists and the non-revisionists. It's the, you know, do Jews have a right, or should Jews, because they do have a, let's say they do have a right. I'm fine with that. You know, if you want to use the Bible as your proof text, then let's say they do have a right. But as Abba Eban said, just because you have the right to do something, it doesn't mean you should do something. And it's an old argument, and we're seeing what's happened when you have Jewish supremacists sitting in the cabinet. You have a Kahana guy, you have a guy who's been charged multiple times not even allowed to serve in the IDF because of terrorism charges, a guy who threatened Rabin days before he was assassinated, threatened him with assassination on TV. He's in the cabinet, you know, and these people are telling Bibi that unless we take over Gaza, we'll leave and put you out of power. So, you know, it's not genocide, and it's not even worth getting. I don't even think it's worth getting caught up in arguments over that. But what's going on is really playing out this generational, years-long argument between two visions of Zionism, and we have to take a side.
I will tell you also, this is making it, to me anyway, more depressing. I spent, 3 full days with Rachel Korazim, this teacher, and she's a dyed-in-the-wool lefty, so understand her perspective. But in our car rides and our quiet times of talking, just the two of us, she spoke with anxiety and fear about the messianic movement that she believes is taking hold, and it's not just Ben Gvir and it's not just Smotrich. She sees it in many segments and many expressions of Israeli society, and she's very worried about what that means for her home.
Well, that was the New York Times investigation, which
Yes.
I have to say,
Yes.
I wrote a column, like 5 weeks ago about this, but about settlers who were running rampant during the olive harvest and destroying olive trees in the West Bank and keeping Palestinians from their olive trees. And there's no law, and there's no soldiers that respond to this. And there's just no point to it other than sheer intimidation and the idea that you're on our land, even though it's literally not their land. It's not owned by them. So, it's such a problem. And there are groups here and in Israel that are fighting against it and supporting people, and there's certainly leaders within the IDF and within Israel that are trying to counter that. But it really is a struggle, and it's a struggle that's been going on since the very beginning. I mean, read about the Altalina. It's a struggle that's been going on since the beginning of Zionism. And it's something that a lot of American Jews don't know about. They think of Israel as, like I said, they just think of it as Israel.
Yeah.
But there are two Israels at least, and you have to learn about them and decide which one aligns with your values.
So I just wanted to mention, in the interest of a diversity of opinion, that something that I'm really worried about in this context is, it was brought up, Israel's losing propaganda war. I think more deeply, people are losing interest in understanding and accepting the truth. And in this war, it's very hard, I think, for a lot of us to accept that we want peace, we want tolerance, but what do you do when the other side has shown what it is? Like, what do you do when these colleges and the left and so many people in this country have shown us who they are, and they're not willing to discuss things, they're not willing to find out what's actually happening? And that makes me think of an article I saw in the foreword recently about basically trashing Israel for the whatever has recently gone on the Associated Press, like Israel needs to leave the Associated Press alone. And it makes me wonder if the journalist knew that maybe the most famous scandal with Israel and the Associated Press was bombing a building that was taken over by Hamas to run a radio jammer to shut down Iron Dome systems. I think that's pretty important context, but I think in a lot of cases, like we live in a liberal democracy, we're generally not right-wing people. It's hard for us to understand what it's like to live with this reality on the other side of the world, and that's how I see it.
It's crucial to understand, as much as, we don't have as much influence over the Palestinian side, our influence is as American Jews, but 3 days after October 7th, I wrote a piece called, Take a Moment and Read the Hamas Charter, because people hadn't.
Yeah.
These are not the good. These are not the good guys, and the fact that Students for Justice in Palestine and these other student campus groups are coming from that world and calling them resistance fighters, they are they're gonna be the end of the Palestinian people. They're gonna take the Palestinians down with them. So what I do is I argue it on, if you care about Palestinians, and there are Palestinians who will say this, certainly the people in Standing Together. There's another great writer who's on social media a lot. His name is, I think, Ahmed al-Khatib, and he's a Palestinian from Gaza who immigrated out on a scholarship and ended up staying in San Jose. He's a brilliant engineer. Has anybody read him? Oh, well then I saw him on TV. Yeah, so I really urge you, wherever your politics are, you will be blown away by his, he lays out the Palestinian case against Hamas. And you could really only argue, not argue, but you could, the best way to help people is like ask them what they care about and ask them if what they're saying is going to help what they care about come to fruition. He deeply cares about the Palestinian people. He had a long piece today on TikTok and on X about how Palestinians should look at that video of the women soldiers. And he said, if you think it's okay because they're soldiers, how would you feel if they were Palestinian women soldiers treated that way? And you just have to appeal to people's sense of, if they want to rescue their own people, is that the best way to do it?
I'll tell you that I learned by...
I wrote it down because I really think it's important people follow him and spread him around. Ahmed Fuad al-Khatib, A-L-K-H-A-T-I-B.
K-H-I-T-A-D.
T-I-B, Ahmed al-Khatib. He's, he's of that generation. He's heavily on social media.
I will confess that I learned from reading your article about the charter, Hamas charter, how frequently the word colonial appears in there. And I don't know if that charge originated with Hamas, but it certainly has been adopted by a wider segments of society, but that really is quite prominent in the charter. Probably time for 2 more questions for now.
So much of what we've been talking about is about stories. And it's been said, I think rightly, that the battle of narratives is something happening right now, that you can understand 1948 to the present and into the future in 2 completely different ways. And you can put the history books side by side as they're taught in Hebrew and in Arabic. And in some ways, I think some of the nausea we're all feeling is because the story we had in our head about Israel has been like a trapdoor opening under us. It's been taken away. And so the heroic beginnings and the Yom Kippur War and I mean, just as the Seder retells a story which constitutes our identity, our younger generation no longer has that story, and in fact are replacing it with a story which sounds like the revisionist version of American history when we discovered that there was racism in America, and the arrival of feminism when we discovered that there was misogyny. And everyone is now discovering what they don't have, but no one is coming forward to tell a story of coexistence or a future other than a messianic future. And I wish this were a question rather than a comment, but if you have an answer, I'd love to hear it.
I do, Marty. I really think the answer to that is, what story do you want people to tell about today in the future? Like, what's the future story? How do you want this to go from here? And that's what we have some role to play in. But when people argue from the right or from the Palestinian side or from the, God forbid, Hamas side, you say, so what's the story you want to have? What do you want to have now? I mean, I never get involved in those arguments about the past. I always say that we could go from 0 to Abraham in 60 seconds. Like, it's so fast. You go like 2024, 1967, 1948, then before Balfour, and then before you know it, it's like the Bible, and then it's like it leads you nowhere but backwards. So what's the future story?
Thanks for being here. And again, in the vein of differences of opinion, it's worrisome to me to hear some of what I'm hearing in the room today. And it's worrisome because at a moment when, as Jews, both here in Israel, in Europe, and just about anywhere on the planet, we are seeing the hate of thousands of years surface, we are sort of nuancing and two-sidesing and all that, and there's a time for it. It worries me that we aren't galvanizing the strength of our community. I think it's reflected in the fact that, there hasn't been a lot in the United States to really galvanize the energy post-October 7th. But just to some of the points that you made, what do you think about those that say that Oslo may have been a fantasy in that it reversed the sequencing, meaning Arab-Jewish peace in the Middle East would come, the Oslo thought was through the Palestinians first, giving them essentially a veto right where all the other Arab countries had to sit behind it, whereas sort of the Abraham Accord approach reversed it and said, hey, we're going to try to find moderate, forward-thinking, primarily Sunni countries who respect Israel for its strengths, regardless of what those strengths are, and its strength. The partnership of the United States is one of those strengths, and access to F-35s and all those things that those guys want, and what do you say to those that would potentially bring your vision? I'm not sure I share it, but the vision of peace, two states, not the Minnesota-Michigan two-state solution, but the two-state solution in the Middle East closer, if we could expand, whether it's with Saudis and others, those arrangements, and then use that as leverage to eventually come to an agreement of two states with the Palestinians. Once the terrorists of Hamas and others, who I don't believe deserve to be on this planet, are cleaned off.
I think we need a gold. I think the right answer is the third choice, because the Abraham Accords were brilliant, but they didn't work. I mean, after them came October 7th. The Abraham Accords, Jared Kushner had a quote shortly after the Abraham Accords was that we'll now see peace in the Middle East. And the reason he was so wrong, and so many people at the time were like, you don't know what you're talking about, is you can't ignore the Palestinian problem. I think you're absolutely right about Oslo. I think it ignored, in order to get to yes, they ignored kind of the elephant in the room. But Abraham Accords also ignored it. So hopefully we've learned our lesson, and that there will be using both the power of all these Gulf states and the allies with Israel, but also pushing Israel, the people in Israel who are resistant to it. And I don't think it's going to be easy, and it may never happen. It may not. I mean, I don't know. But to come to some kind of arrangement with the Palestinians. I'm not like a two-state, or like, it's not my solution. It's what they could do whatever they want. I don't care. But they have to come to some kind of rapprochement, these two people there. Without that, the other stuff's not, you just can't. One thing we learned is you can't maintain the status quo. And if that were possible, then we would have had peace after the Abraham Accords.
I want to say a couple things to close the night. First of all, the last question I was going to ask you is who should we read? But you already you jumped that one. Thank you. Great. Anybody else you want to make sure that want to suggest that we're reading right now?
Well, you should read the foreword.
Obviously. Second thing, the next one of these will be with Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Zasloff. We're going to focus a little bit more on foreign policy, which is his area of expertise. And the third thing, thank you all for being here, and I really want to note especially those who were brave enough to voice a question or an opinion that did not feel like it was in concert with the rest of the room. Those are exactly the kind of conversations I want us to have, and it's hard to be that person. So thank you for coming. Thank you for asking questions. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Rob Eshman, for being our first speaker tonight. Maybe you'll stick around a few minutes. I think some people had some more questions.